The gates of Varnhalo were made of iron and old stone, and they did not open quietly. I heard them from my study 3 floors above, the low complaint of the hinges, the clatter of horse hooves on the cobbled approach, the efficient bark of my steward Renwick directing a party of 7 through the outer yard. I did not go to the window. I had already been told who was coming, a woman named Senna of Millbridge, sent by the 3 lesser houses of the Green River Valley as a treaty candidate. The arrangement had been reached without my asking. My counsel had managed it while I was at the northern border settling a water dispute, and by the time I returned, the letters of agreement were already sealed and waiting on my desk alongside the border dispatches and the quarterly grain summary and the 17 other things requiring my attention. I had said nothing when Furwick laid out the terms at the council table. I read them, set them down, asked whether the Krassenhold border agreement was finalized. Furwick said it was. I dismissed the council. They took my silence for consent, as they generally did, and they were not wrong to do so. I had no objection to a candidate arriving. I had no particular enthusiasm for it either. What I had was the awareness that this was a matter I would need to give proper attention. At 36, I had governed Varnhalo for 14 years without a mate. The hold ran well. The pack was stable. The eastern border was managed with patience. The valley alliances held because I maintained them with care. I had taken my father's governance and made it my own, careful, respectful of the pack's nature, attentive to the land and the people who worked it, and there was nothing visibly wanting in how things ran. But Broad had been using the word succession with an increasing frequency. He embedded it in morning briefings, in dispatches, in casual observations, with the patient persistence of a second who had decided that a thing needed to happen and was going to keep at it until the alpha acknowledged the point. My counsel was doing the same in its collective way. Documents left on my desk, treaty language, that always managed to mention the stability of a clear inheritance line, the northern lords including in their trade, correspondence the polite subtext of questions about the future governance of Varnhalo. A candidate was the least complicated response to a pressure that was only going to increase. Still, I did not go to the window. I returned to the trade ledger. The Millbridge region produced river flax, grain, river clay vessels the southern markets valued. Senna's father was a healer of local standing. The dossier Furwick compiled was thin on her specifically and thick on her father's reputation for thorough, reliable preparation work. She had no wolf of her own. The 3 houses had described her as gentle and composed, of good character and sound health, which were the words of men who had run out of more compelling things to say, or who believed the qualities they were describing did not reduce easily to formal language. I returned to the ledger. The autumn trade figures were genuinely interesting. I told myself that was why I stayed at my desk. Renwick knocked at the hour of sunset. "She's settled in the east wing, my lord. Requests nothing beyond warm water and supper in her room." I set down my pen, not in the hall. She said she didn't want to be a disruption on her first evening. Renwick paused. He had been my steward for 11 years and had developed very precise habits about when to pause. She organized her own kit before Merritt finished with the room, thanked Merritt for it when she was done. "For what?" "For the room, my lord. She said it was a good room." I studied him. Renwick did not offer unsolicited observations without purpose. "You liked her." "I found her unremarkable, my lord," he said, which had been his way of saying yes for 11 years. I dismissed him. My wolf settled at the edge of my awareness with the quality he used when something had shifted in the air without announcing itself. Not agitation, not urgency, simply a turned attention, the way a person turns their head toward a sound they cannot yet identify. I told him to be still. He did not argue, he settled and watched. I went back to the ledger and read the same column 4 times before I gave it up. The kitchen garden was the first thing she asked about. Not in the meeting I had expected, not at the council table, not in the formal assessment walk Renwick had scheduled for the fourth day. She asked on the morning of her arrival before supper, when Renwick was showing her the East Wing rooms, and she looked from the window at the walled rectangle below and said, "What's that used for?" Renwick, to his credit, did not hesitate. "The kitchen garden, my lady, somewhat out of repair." "Who tends it?" A pause. "No one at present. The last gardener left in August. We've been using the market supplies." She looked at the garden from the window for a moment longer. "I'd like to see it tomorrow," she said, "if that's agreeable." Renwick told me this later with the carefully neutral tone he used when he had made an assessment and was reporting the evidence rather than the conclusion. I understood the evidence. A woman sent as a treaty candidate, arriving after 3 days hard riding, who looked out her first window and asked about the kitchen garden. Not the great hall, not the council chamber, not the packed quarters, not any of the things people typically wanted to see when they were attempting to understand the scope of what they might be entering. The kitchen garden, the thing that needed tending. I lay my reading aside that evening and thought about that for longer than was strictly necessary. The first formal dinner was on the second evening. The table had been set for 9. Myself at the head, Broad at my right, Councillor Furwick and Councillor Vand on my council side, and then the treaty candidate placed at the formal position to my left in the traditional arrangement that meant something and was meant to be seen to mean something, with Renwick's deputy Merritt handling the seating so that no one had to make the more uncomfortable arrangement explicit. She arrived punctually and wore dark blue and sat down with the composure of someone who had decided to be present in the room without making the room a performance. She thanked Merritt for the seating arrangement, thanked her, specifically, not the room generally, noticed the woman doing the work and acknowledged it. Merritt came back from that exchange slightly wider in her expression than she had been before, and Merritt had been doing formal service at Varnhello for 9 years. I watched this from the doorway where I stood with Broad receiving the final briefing on the evening's agenda. The treaty discussion had 3 items. The border terms needed 1 more review pass. The grain allocation from the Millbridge region was a secondary consideration worth raising. Broad said all of this. I received it and said nothing. She had found Worth. I had not arranged this. Worth had appeared at formal dinners for 4 decades with the undefeatable stubbornness of a man who believes that good governance requires the presence of honest knowledge, even when the people governing would prefer to manage without it. He sat at the far end of the table precisely because 40 years had demonstrated that he would arrive at some point regardless, and there was a calculus to his position that had been worked out long before my tenure began. He ate with the quiet efficiency of a man who is performing a biological obligation and would prefer to be elsewhere, and he had not, in 11 years of serving under me, sustained anything I would describe as a social conversation at a formal dinner. She asked him about the marsh sage preparation. Not as an opening gambit, not as a conversation technique. She had seen the volume he was carrying under his arm. He always carried something. It was how he tolerated the dinners and recognized it and said, "Is that Brenwick's preparation guide?" I thought the only copies were in the Southern Archives. Worth looked at her with the attention he gave things that had surprised him. "The second edition. Do you know it?" My father quoted it constantly. He disagreed with most of the marsh sage section. She sat down and put her napkin in her lap and said, "What's your position on the oil separation temperature?" Worth leaned forward. He remained leaning forward for the better part of an hour. I was told this by Broad, who was monitoring the entire table with his second's systematic thoroughness. I knew it because I observed the posture from the head of the table at intervals I could not entirely account for. Between the agenda items I had asked Furwick to move through, and the grain allocation discussion that happened around and below this, while something more interesting was occurring at the far end. Worth had the look he wore when he was arguing with a mind he had decided was worth arguing with, slightly combative, deeply engaged, animated in a way the dinners had not managed to produce in him in the length of my memory. Furwick made his inquiry about Senna's family standing among the valley houses. She received it and answered it with the clean accuracy of a woman who had decided that useful information was worth providing and self-promotion was not. Her father's practice, his reputation, the specific preparations the valley knew him for, facts, not claims. Furwick's prepared follow-up, which had clearly been intended to elicit something about her aspirations or her family's broader standing or her view of the political arrangement, did not find purchase. She did not offer anything beyond the facts. He looked mildly at sea. She was not being difficult. She was being exactly what she had told me. She was a person who had no interest in performing what was expected and was not going to manage the dinner like a candidate interview. She answered what was asked her own questions of the people she was interested in, and treated the event as a gathering of people she was attempting to honestly understand, which turned out to be a more effective approach than any of the things the treaty framework had been designed to reveal. Lady Mare's counterpart in the valley arrangements, the North Flank steward whose name was Derry, attempted twice to redirect her toward the kind of social conversation that could be assessed as appropriate candidate behavior. She redirected him back with a gentleness so practiced it was almost invisible. A question about the northern flax harvest that turned out to be genuinely informed. A point about river clay vessel repairs that Derry had not expected her to know, which opened a conversation about the Craft Guild's winter apprenticeship schedule that occupied them both until the third course arrived. She ate without seeming to manage it. When the wine went round, she accepted her cup and drank from it at appropriate intervals. When the conversation at her end of the table lulled, she let the lull exist and did not fill it artificially. There was no performance happening. There was simply a woman being present in the room she was in. At the end of the dinner, she thanked the kitchen staff, not Renwick, not me, but the two young men who came in to clear the plates, looked at them directly, thanked them. They went back to the kitchen with slightly startled expressions, because that specific moment of direct acknowledgement was not standard to the formal dinner arrangement at Varnhallow. Brode, after the guests had dispersed, came to my study with the brandy and said, "She told Worth he's been burning off the volatile compounds at the wrong temperature for 6 years. What did he say?" He asked if she had her father's original notes, and when she said they were in her kit, he asked if she could bring them tomorrow. She said yes. She told him she'd bring the full preparation journal and he could check the sourcing himself. Brode poured the second glass. He thanked her. Worth said thank you to perhaps 4 people in my governance experience, and 2 of them were dead. The kitchen south bed, Brode added. She's left a cutting there with instructions for the spring gardener. Merritt found it when she went to bank the frame. She didn't say anything to anyone, just left it, addressed to whoever would be working the bed in March. I set down my glass. And the garden kit, Brode continued. Before Merritt finished arranging the East Wing room, she had her own things organized. Thanked Merritt when she came in to complete the setup. You said. I'm saying it again because Merritt mentioned it twice to the kitchen housekeeper, which in my experience means she found it worth saying twice. He took his glass and went out. I sat by the fire and thought about a woman who left notes for spring gardeners in gardens that were not yet hers, and looked at my lamp, and told myself I was tired from the council meeting, and did not entirely believe myself. The second morning, I found the lavender. Or rather, she found it. I was there when she found it. I had been there since the 4th bell, because the East Garden was where I went when I wanted to be somewhere that did not require anything of me. And she had arrived before the household woke with her kit and her grafting knife and her complete attention directed at the lavender's root line, and had not heard me approach because, when she was attending to something, she attended to it completely. Gray eyes, gray wool, the early morning cold making her breath visible in small, steady clouds. Not performing the examination, doing it. The difference is in the hands. She had her fingers in the soil. Her kit was open with precision. Cloth, file, knife, a wrapped cutting, a corked bottle of something that turned out to be diluted bone meal. Every tool in a specific order. A woman who worked with her hands and had worked with them long enough that her kit was organized the way her mind was organized. Clearly, purposefully, without excess. When she startled and looked up, the assessment in her eyes was immediate and genuine. Not the calculated reading of a woman preparing to give the correct response to the Alpha King of Varnhallow. An actual evaluation of where I was standing, what my posture suggested, whether the situation required recalibration. She recalibrated within the second and rose and smoothed her dress and met my gaze with the steadiness of someone who had been startled, but was not going to be undone by it. "I know," she said when I pointed out the lavender was dormant, and then immediately the soil report, the root line, the lower third, the first hard freeze, the timeline for intervention. She said all of this, and then registered that she had led with it, and something moved through her expression, not mortification. She was too composed for full mortification. The very slight wince of a person who has noticed that they have done exactly what they had decided not to do, which was to arrive in any situation and immediately report what needed fixing. "Don't apologize," I told her. "You're right about the soil." The relief was small and immediate and genuine. I sat on the cracked bench. She did not sit, she did not ask if she could, and I did not invite her formally, and the result was that she simply stopped hovering at the hedge's edge and occupied the space as though the permission to be in it was obvious and did not require negotiation. This seemed to be how she moved through all spaces, not assuming familiarity, not performing deference, simply taking the clear, correct position and standing in it. The morning was cold. A pair of wood pigeons moved through the old oak beyond the garden wall. The starlings were in the high branches, conducting their usual complicated argument. From inside the hold came the smell of the bread beginning, the warm yeast of it drifting out through whatever gap in the kitchen shutters it found. She was wearing a plain wool shawl over the gray dress, and it was not warm enough for the morning, but she showed no sign of being uncomfortable with the cold. A healer from a river village would have spent a great deal of time in cold morning conditions. The adjustment was already made. "You came from Millbridge," I said. "Yes, 3 days' ride. A long way to come as a treaty candidate." She considered whether to answer this directly. I could see the consideration, brief, clean, the kind of assessment she seemed to complete very quickly. She answered it directly. "I want to be straightforward with you from the start, my lord. If that's acceptable. Preferable." The full assessment again, before the thing she had decided to say. "I was asked to come. I came because it seemed wrong to refuse a direct request from 3 houses that have been good to my family's work for a long time. But I don't have any expectation of being chosen. I'm not here to perform for you. If you need someone who sits beautifully at your table and says all the right things to all the right people in the right order, I'm not that person. I know what I am, a healer's daughter from a river village who now runs her father's practice. I thought it was better to say so on the first morning than to spend a week pretending otherwise and waste both our time. The cold air, the wood pigeons. Somewhere behind my ribs, my wolf had stopped being still in the way that meant he was attending to something with his full focus. Not agitation, not urgency, the particular alert quality of a wolf who has found a scent that requires his complete attention. "How long were you planning to stay?" I asked. "A week. I brought materials I've been working through, my father's preparation journal, and several reference volumes. Your kitchen garden looked interesting from the road. I can keep to the east wing and stay entirely out of the way of whatever else you have going on." "My kitchen garden," I said, "is in worse repair than this lavender bed." I stood. "You're welcome to look at it. breakfast in the hall at the 7th bell. I'd prefer you join us rather than eat alone. A pause, not hesitation. The pause of someone confirming that an instruction was the instruction and not a suggestion. I'll be there. She went back to her kit. I went back inside and looked at the trade ledger without reading it, and thought about gray eyes in the cold morning, and told myself I was thinking about the practical matter of the treaty process and the hold's interests, and did not precisely believe myself. The kitchen garden. I went there at the 4th bell that afternoon before the council's second review session, because I was passing on the way from the records chamber to the practice yard, and the gate was open. This was what I told myself. She was working the south bed's compacted root zone with the focused intentionality of someone who has identified a problem and is solving it at the correct pace, not hurrying, not showing off, simply working at the rate that the work required. Her coat was off and hung on the fence post. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow in the cold. Her kit was open on the bench in the careful order I had already come to recognize from the lavender examination. She had been at it for some time. The south bed's compaction had been significant. I knew because I had looked at the bed once with the previous head gardener and been told it would require at least 2 days of sustained work before it was ready for winter preparation. She had the better portion of it done. There was bone meal in a shallow channel she had opened along the root line, and she was pressing a cutting into the loosened earth with the attention of someone making certain it would hold. She did not notice me at the gate. I stayed there for a time, the length of time a man stays when he has told himself he is passing through and is not, in fact, passing through, and knows this and is doing the thing anyway. She worked the earth. The cold afternoon sat still around her. Fenwick appeared at the far end of the garden, his gray-muzzled old form emerging from the passage by the kitchen door, with the unhurried confidence of a wolf who goes where he wishes because, at 30-odd years, he has earned the right, and came to stand near her without announcement. She noticed him. She stopped working and said something I could not hear low, even the voice for animals, did not reach out, did not move toward him, waited. He came the rest of the way to her, and she let him smell her hands and then went back to the cutting. He lay down on the cold garden stones 2 feet away and watched her work. I was still at the gate when she finished the south bed's main channel, 40 minutes, maybe more. I don't know when I stopped tracking time. When she brushed the soil from her hands and stood to reach for a piece of cloth from the kit, she turned and found me, and the startlement this time was smaller. She was getting accustomed to me appearing, or to the possibility of it. "The south bed," I said. "Done. I've left a note on the stake about the maintenance. The channel needs to stay open through the first freeze, and the bone meal will need a second application in late February." She was cleaning the grafting knife with the cloth and not looking at me with the attention of someone who is listening to what you are not saying. "There's a drainage problem behind the east stone footer that's going to be more work, but it can wait until spring if someone knows it's there." "I'll leave a note for the spring staff," I said. She looked at me. "I already did," she said. In the gate's shadow, out of her sight, my wolf made a sound I had not heard him make in a very long time, low, sustained, the sound of a recognition he had been carrying quietly for some time and had decided to say aloud. On the 3rd morning, I was in the practice yard at dawn working the blade forms, and 6 wolves appeared without being called. I have said this, but I should say what it meant. Rook had not come voluntarily to a stranger since the Eastern Market incident 4 years ago, in which a visiting trader's dog had bitten his flank, and he had responded with a restraint that cost him, that had left a wound both physical and in the deeper territory of his willingness to offer trust to those he did not know. He had healed. The pack had circled him through it, and the flank scar was gone. But the voluntary approach to strangers was something he had simply stopped doing, and I had respected this without pressing it. A pack elder has the right to determine his own limits. Pale was Rook's daughter and had been startled young in a specific incident I will not go into in detail, the short version of which is that she had learned very early that sudden movements from unexpected directions carried consequences, and she had organized her world accordingly. She moved along walls. She preferred corners. She was not fearful in any way that compromised her functioning as a pack member. She was a strong hunter, a reliable tracker, well regarded in the pack's internal arrangements, but she startled, and she had learned to manage this by keeping herself at the edge of situations where she had maximum sightline and minimum exposure to unpredictable movement. She was in that practice yard at dawn, the morning of the third day, having voluntarily left a corner somewhere and followed Rook through the practice yard gate. Fenwick was there. Fenwick, who had spent the past year becoming gradually less interested in leaving the hall hearth, who moved slowly on the cold mornings and stayed warm when the pack ran the evening circuit, who was present in the hold as an elder who had served his time and was keeping himself in good comfort as the time remaining to him allowed. Fenwick was there on the practice yard stones in the morning cold with the mid-pack wolves, which meant he had decided something. She was in the gate with her basket and her kit. She saw them. She stopped. I watched her from the other side of the yard with my blade in my hand and waited to see what she would do, because what a person does in the first few seconds of finding a strange pack between themselves and their destination tells you quite a lot about who that person is. She went still, not frozen still, the considered stillness of someone who understands animals well enough to know that the right response to finding animals assessing you is to give them the time they need to complete the assessment. No sharp movements, no forward pressure, no reaching. She held her basket loosely and her face was open and she let them look. Then she crouched. It brings the height down. It changes what the face communicates. It is the position of a being who is making itself smaller and less imposing on purpose, not out of submission, but out of consideration. I am aware that I am a stranger here and I would like you to make your own assessment. She held the position and said, in the quiet conversational voice you use with animals when you want to communicate that there is nothing threatening here. Good morning. I'm just passing through. Fenwick walked to her, his old legs on the cold stones, step by step across the full width of the practice yard, without hurry, with the deliberate purpose of a wolf who has made a decision and is carrying it out. She held out her hand at the right moment, not too early, not a reach, simply an offered hand at the correct distance for a wolf to close the last of the gap himself. He closed it. He sniffed her hand. Then he pushed his head beneath her palm. The sound that went through the pack at that moment was not audible. It was the pack frequency shift I could feel in my chest, the way the air changes when the wolves collectively update. Not an announcement, a recognition. Rook sat down with the slow, deliberate authority of an elder rendering a formal judgment. He sat and he did not move. She looked at Fenwick in her hand, then across the yard at me. I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to disturb them. You didn't disturb them, I said. They came here on their own. She looked at the pack again, all 6 of them, and Rook sitting with his elder's stillness, and Pale 2 feet behind her father watching with the watchfulness of a wolf who has permitted this situation to be closer than she would normally allow and is finding it acceptable. Something moved through her face that was not the pleased calculation of a woman assessing an advantage. It was simpler than that, quieter than that. The expression of someone who has been given something they did not expect and find themselves genuinely moved by. May I stay with them for a moment, she asked, before the garden? As long as you like, I said. I went back to the blade forms. Behind me, I heard her settle, not sitting, but moving down from the crouch to a more comfortable position on the practice yard stones, with the unself-conscious practicality of a woman who had decided the ground was fine and the cold was manageable. She began talking to the wolves. The low, even voice, the same one she used for the plants, the voice that carried information without demanding any particular response to it. She told them about the kitchen garden. What she had found there, what she had done with it, what the south bed would look like by February if the winter was not too severe, and someone did the second bone meal application correctly. Pale lay down. Pale, who startled at sudden movement and lived in corners and had been 2 feet behind her father for the safety the distance provided, lay down on the cold practice yard, stones close enough that her shoulder was against Senna's knee. I kept moving through the forms with the mechanical patience of someone completing a task and not thinking about the thing they are not thinking about. My wolf had stopped being a presence at the edge of my awareness and become a presence at the center of it, not demanding anything, not pushing, simply very fully there. Like fire that has been tended correctly and is now burning with the complete intention of a fire that intends to keep burning. Steady. Constant. I thought, I am in trouble. I thought this with the calm interest of a man who has understood something he has been edging toward for some time and has now arrived at the understanding. Not alarm, not resistance, simply the recognition of a fact. I did the blade forms. She talked to the wolves. Pale pressed her shoulder against Senna's knee, and Rook sat in his elder judgment, and Fenwick, old, gray-muzzled Fenwick, who had served 3 generations of Varnhallow and who carried in his body the long memory of what this pack had been and what it could be, kept his head in her hand. On the 4th day, we walked the public rooms. Renwick had prepared the route with his usual thoroughness. Gallery, council chamber, great hall, armory, elder library. The order was traditional. The purpose was to give a candidate an understanding of the hold's scope and history, which was also a way of giving the hold an understanding of what the candidate found interesting. Renwick had learned in 11 years to watch what people paused at, what they asked about, what they moved past quickly. He would have a complete report for me before the evening bell. She moved through the spaces the way she moved through every space, with the attentive, unhurried presence of someone who is genuinely attempting to understand the thing she is looking at, not performing comprehension. She did not say things like, "How magnificent," or "What a history." She said what she actually saw. The founding tapestry she looked at for 3 full minutes, long enough that I was aware she was still there after I had moved slightly ahead. She stopped me with a question. The wolves in the tapestry, why smaller than the current pack? I told her about the northern mountain bloodline my grandfather brought in. She asked how you maintain a lineage over 3 generations of a complex breeding program. I told her what I knew about it. The pack's memory, the old bones holding the new blood, the way the original purpose persisted through adaptation. She listened the way she listened, completely, taking it in, not preparing her next comment while I was still speaking. She connected it to something her father had said about valley medicinal plants. The way the chemistry shifts with elevation and season, but the root uses hold. The plant adapts, the purpose holds. She said this and then moved to the next tapestry without appearing to track whether I had found it interesting, because she had offered it as a thought she genuinely had, not as a thought designed to impress. It was, I thought, one of the more precise things anyone had said to me about the pack's lineage in a considerable time. In the council chamber, the River Oak table took her attention before Renwick could give his prepared explanation. She ran her hand along the edge and named the wood, and identified the grain, and explained the density of a tree that grows with its roots in standing water for part of each cycle. Renwick, whose prepared explanation of the River Oak table was one of the more reliable elements of the assessment walk, looked at her with the expression of a man who has been thoroughly but courteously outmaneuvered. "Your father worked with River Oak?" he asked. "He repaired a River Oak gate in the lower Green Valley once," she said. "He discussed the grain for a month. He was particular about wood." She ran her hand along the edge again. "This was cut in autumn or very late summer before the first high water. You can tell from the ring pattern the tree had finished its growing cycle before the blade went in. Better stability. Someone knew what they were doing." Renwick made a small note in his ledger. He did not normally make notes in his ledger during the assessment walk. In the great hall she looked up at the beamwork. Asked about the smoke configuration. There was a particular arrangement of the upper vents designed to draw smoke from a dozen fires simultaneously, and it was one of the more interesting pieces of engineering in the hold. Renwick explained it with the enthusiasm of a man who has wanted someone to ask about the smoke vents for 11 years. She followed the explanation with 3 precise questions about the material calculations involved, and an observation about a similar system she had seen once in a valley hall that had solved the low-wind problem differently. Renwick's note-making accelerated. The armory. The broken campaign chest was in the corner where it had been for 6 years. The lock had a mechanism that required a specific key-casting modification to operate, and the last smith who understood the modification had been dead for 4 years, and the chest had been functionally sealed. It held nothing of urgent importance: old campaign documents, some correspondence my father had considered confidential. But it was there, and the lock was broken, and this was one of those things that sits in a corner accumulating dust while you wait for the right knowledge to arrive. She found it immediately and asked Renwick about the lock without naming what she was seeing. She let him describe the problem. Then, the second-generation Millbridge casting modification, the quarter-turn correction. She looked at Renwick. "Do you know it?" Renwick, with dignity. "I don't believe we have that specification here." "I have my father's notes on it," she said. "He modified 3 of them in the lower valley. I'll copy the relevant section for you. It's not complicated if you have a smith who can do fine mechanism work." By the time we reached the elder library, Renwick had a full page of notes and the look of a man whose professional thoroughness has been met with something that matches its register. He was, I recognized, constructing a private assessment that differed significantly from the assessment his formal notes would record. Then the elder library. She moved through the shelves with the unhurried pleasure of a person who loves books and has entered a room full of books, and has given herself permission to simply be in that room for a moment. She was not performing interest. She ran fingers along spines in the unself-conscious way that people with long reading habits move through collections, not reading, just touching the backs of things, feeling the texture of accumulated time. The binding seal above the door she found when she reached the end of the first shelf row and turned back toward the entrance. She looked at it for a moment before asking, "What is that?" I told her, the 3 rings, the oaths they each held, the first for the pack, the second for the Valley Alliance, the third for the mated bond. My grandmother's seal, completed in the first year of my grandfather's governance. The inner ring opened since my father's 3rd year, since the winter when my mother did not come back from the fever, and the seal sitting incomplete through all the governance that came after. She looked at the break in the inner ring. She was quiet for a long moment, not filling the silence with the appropriate sympathetic response, not processing toward a comment, simply looking at it. Then, that must have been a lonely seal to look at, all those years. She turned to the shelves before I could answer, found a volume she had recognized from the spine, and pulled it gently from its place, and opened it with the care of someone handling something that has been kept well. She was not looking at me. She had said the thing because she thought it was worth saying, because it was true, and she had moved on. The elder library was quiet around us. The afternoon light came through the single high window at the angle it reached in late autumn, and the dust in the light moved with the particular slowness of a room that holds old things and does not hurry. My wolf had gone entirely still, not the alert stillness of a watch, not the restless stillness of something resisted, the stillness of having heard something that confirmed what he already knew, and finding no further action was required. I stood in the library with a woman who looked at broken things and named them honestly, and felt the quiet of it settle in my chest the way good quiet does, not empty, but full of the right kind of presence. The 5th morning she was at the river before dawn. Broad told me at the first briefing, with the specificity of a man who has already decided a piece of information is worth noting. He said it the way he said things he wanted me to receive, precisely once, with enough detail to be useful, without drawing any conclusion I had not drawn myself. She had gone to the western boundary before the household woke. She had come back before the first meal. He said no more than this. He went on to the border dispatch. I went to the western boundary in the afternoon. The tributary there ran gray and low in its clay banks, the cold of the year pressing down on the water until it moved carefully, with intention, as though conserving itself against the season. The bend where the current slowed was a quiet place. Willows on the far bank, leaf-stripped now, their arms in the water. Clay flats where you could read the season in the tide marks. The kind of place that holds things that don't get held in faster water. She had been at the flat stone at the bend. The 3 sticks driven into the soft earth with a strip of cloth stretched between them, a healer's field marker, the type her father's practice used for sites worth coming back to. Not a permanent mark, a promise. She had found something here and had staked it as though she expected to return. I crouched at the bank edge and looked at the soil profile where her marker was. The sedge she would find in spring was not visible yet. It needed the thaw, the first warm weeks to bring the growth up. But the root structure was there in the clay, and the specific conditions that had produced it. The slower current bringing silt, the clay bank retaining moisture, the winter cold driving the roots to unusual depth. A variant that required a very specific confluence to produce. You would not find it in faster water or in sandier soil or in the full current sections of the green. You would find it here at this bend, if you knew what you were looking for. She had known what she was looking for. She had found it on the 5th morning. She had marked it as hers to come back to. I stayed at the bank for longer than I had planned and walked back to the hold, with the feeling of a man who has been shown something he had not expected to see, and is still turning it over. At supper, I asked about the marker. She described the sedge variant with precision. The narrower leaf, the darker stem, the deeper root system, the specific oil content that made it worth processing separately from the lowland variety. Her father's preparation work with the upland sedge. The different yield and the specific uses the different oil content served. "I'd like to take a proper cutting in spring," she said. "Come back in spring," I said. She was quiet. The small east wing table had become, without formal negotiation, where we ate in the evenings, not a decision that had been made but a default that had accumulated from the first evening when Renwick had set it for 2, and neither of us had raised the topic of whether it should be different. It was the right size for honest conversation. It required no arrangement. The fire was close enough to be warm without being performative. The east wing windows looked over the kitchen garden, and from where she sat she could see the south bed she had dressed and the stake with the spring note. "I'm not certain what the arrangement will be by spring," she said. "The arrangement is whatever we decide it to be," I said. She looked at me with the healer's look, the look that takes in the full situation without editing it. "I want to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." The small table between us, the fire, the kitchen garden in the dark outside the window with its dressed beds and its stakes. "Do you want a mate?" The question landed in the room with the clean weight of something that has been in the air for days and has finally been said aloud. No one in the treaty process had named it directly. The letters of agreement spoke of an appropriate bonding arrangement and the succession conditions. Brode's careful pressure had always been adjacent to the word rather than the word itself. The council's circling was all implication and strategic framing. She named it the way she named the compacted soil and the sedge variant. As a thing it was useful to know if you were going to talk honestly about the situation you were both in. "I don't know," I said. "I meant this exactly. I've thought about it as a political matter for a long time, a council question, a succession question. I haven't thought about it as something I wanted." She nodded, turning it over with the care she gave to things worth turning over. "And now," she said. The fire was low. The evening pressed cold against the east wing windows. Below in the kitchen garden, the beds she had dressed were doing in the dark what she had prepared them to do. I thought about a woman who left notes for spring gardeners in a garden that was not yet hers, who marked river banks as though she expected to return, who asked my wolves how the kitchen garden was doing and let them answer with their own kind of listening. Now, I said, I am beginning to think about it differently. She looked at my face with the healer's honest directness and then looked at her hands. Something in the set of her shoulders had changed, a very small shift, the barely perceptible adjustment of someone who has received a piece of information they have been attending to and has registered it precisely. Then she looked up and met my gaze and said, quietly, I see. We finished supper. She said good evening and took her lamp and went to the east wing. I sat alone at the small table and listened to my wolf, who had been patient through the whole of the treaty week, with the patience of a wolf who has made up his mind, and is waiting for the alpha to arrive at the same conclusion, and who was now very fully awake and very fully certain, and making certain I could feel both of these things at considerable volume. On the 6th morning I knew. Not arrived at, recognized. The way you recognize a fact that has been assembling itself in the background and has simply completed. I lay in the dark before dawn and understood that I had known since the morning of the first day. Since gray eyes looking up at me from a crouching position in a cold garden with earth on her hands, saying something true and then apologizing for having said it. Since don't apologize. Since the way she held the benches quiet without filling it. I understood that I had spent 6 days with a woman who had arrived telling me she was not going to perform and had then simply not performed, had not, at any point, modulated herself for my benefit or for the treaty's benefit or for any benefit at all. She had been exactly what she was. She had said what she thought. She had done what she came to do. She had talked to my wolves as though they were colleagues and left notes for gardeners she would never meet, and found the sedge variant on the western bank on the 5th morning, and marked it as a place she intended to come back to. My wolf had known on the 3rd morning when Fenwick walked across the practice yard and put his head under her palm. The pack had known. Rook's sitting down with his elder's finality and Pale pressing her shoulder against Senna's knee were the pack's formal opinions, as clearly expressed as any council vote. The wolves had known. I had been thinking clearly for 6 days, and I was finished thinking. The lords arrived at the 2nd bell. Lord Cassock of the Millbridge Valley came first, a solid man in his 50s who had known Senna's father for 30 years, and who carried in his eyes the watchful attention of someone who has given something of value and is waiting for the account of how it was received. Lord Errol of the Fenwick Uplands arrived with his clerks already sorting documents before they were through the outer yard gate, a man whose efficiency was not rudeness, but simply his natural mode of operation. Lady Mare of the River Watch poured herself a cup of tea in the antechamber before the council session began, which had been her established practice at every meeting I had ever held with her, and I respected it because it was completely honest, and because Lady Mare had earned the right to begin meetings on her own terms. I went to the East Garden first. She was on the cracked bench with a volume from the Elder Library. She had asked Worth's permission before borrowing it, which was how I found out she had borrowed it, because Worth had told Broad with the tone of a man who has had an experience he was not expecting. She closed it when she saw my face. "The lords are here," she said. "Yes." I sat down beside her on the bench, close enough that our voices would stay between us. The morning was gray and sharp. The lavender hedge behind us still held the soil corrections she had made on the first day. "I want to speak with you before I go in." She waited, the patient quality of someone who has already composed themselves for this conversation. "The terms as my counsel drafted them. You would be named my mate, the ceremony within the season, the lesser houses would have their alliance. You know the terms." "I know them." "I'm going to go into that chamber and dissolve the mating timeline. Not the river duty terms or the healer access in the valley or the council seat for the Green Lords. Those stand and I'll honor them completely. but I won't be bound by a mating arranged by treaty, and I won't bind you by one. A pause. And then I want to ask you, not as a candidate, not as a treaty arrangement, whether you would be willing to stay in Varnhello past the week. She was entirely still. Not the watchful stillness of a woman receiving news she had not anticipated. The composed stillness of someone who is holding a thing very carefully because it is something they want to hold carefully. Why, she said, fair, direct, the way she asked everything. Because in 6 days I have stopped thinking about any of this as a political matter, I said. I think about the woman who told me my lavender soil was compacted on the morning we met, and then apologized for having said it. The woman who sat in the practice yard with Fenwick, because she wasn't ready to leave before he was. The woman who found a sedge variant on the western bank and drove a stake in the earth and marked it as a place she intended to come back to in spring. I looked at her steadily. I think you are a serious person. I think this hold could use one. I think my wolf made up his mind on the third morning, which makes it seem discourteous not to consult him. A pause. And I think, if I am being completely honest, that it would be a considerable loss to let you go back to Millbridge. She looked at the book in her lap, then at her hands, then at me. What if I want to think about it, she said. Then the east wing is yours as long as you need it. The kitchen garden and the river are yours. Worth will have questions about the marsh sage preparation for the better part of a year, and you have my full permission to bore him right back. Something moved under the composure, something warmer, less carefully held, the expression of a person who has been standing on ground she was managing with care and has just discovered it is solid. She was quiet for a moment, then, I don't need to think about it. I waited. She looked at the cracked bench and then at the lavender hedge and then somewhere in the middle distance, the considering look of someone deciding how to say what is true. I marked the sedge bed because I was already thinking about coming back. I knew it 3 days in. I came here for a polite week and found things worth staying for: the garden, the library, the wolves, the east wing table. Worth. Another pause, smaller. You were one of the things worth staying for. So yes, not as a treaty. As the thing I want. My wolf, the part of me that had been waiting with the patient certainty of something that has already decided and is allowing events the time they need, settled. Deep and absolute and warm. The warmth of something that has been cold for a long time and has come in out of the weather. Good, I said. She looked at me with one more expression I had not seen from her before, a very small, unguarded smile, not the polite one, the one underneath it. I went to the council chamber. I dissolved the mating timeline in 4 sentences at the head of the table. Errol's clerk's pen stopped moving. Cassick's careful face went careful in a different way, the way of a man reassessing a situation with new data. Lady Mare set her teacup down. I kept the river duty terms, the valley healer access, the council seat for the Green Lord representatives. I dissolved the condition that required a mating ceremony within the season. I said this was on the grounds that a mating arranged by treaty was not a mating I was interested in, and that the 3 houses would be better served by an alliance built on what was actually happening at Varnhello than by a ceremony completed to satisfy a schedule. Lady Mare said, "Is this a rejection?" "The opposite," I said. "I'm removing the part that makes it feel like a trade." She looked at me. Lady Mare assessed things with the comprehensive efficiency of a woman who had been operating grain logistics on a major river tributary for 20 years and did not have patience for imprecision. Whatever she found in my expression, it satisfied her. That's a fair distinction. Cassick had been quiet through the brief exchange, the quiet of a man who is calculating something and wants to have the calculation complete before he speaks. Then, simply, "She's a good woman, my lord. Her father's a good man." He let the silence after it make the rest of the observation for him. "I know," I said, "both things." The terms were finalized before the evening bell, 3 substantive elements standing. The timeline dissolved. All parties in the room understood what had been decided and what remained to be decided in its own time on its own terms, and no one felt the need to make this explicit, which is what happens when an agreement has been reached honestly. Senna sat at supper between Cassock and Worth, and did not know it had gone so cleanly until I told her during the walk between the hall and the east wing corridor after the lords had retired. She received it with a nod, the nod of someone filing a piece of information in the correct place. Then, what did Cassock say? I told her. She was quiet for a moment. He knew my father when they were young men, before the practice, before I was born. They used to argue about the lower valley irrigation problem. Neither of them ever solved it. A pause and a small sound that was close to a laugh. He's going to feel responsible for this for the rest of his life. In the good way. She went to the east wing. I stood in the corridor for a moment with my hand on the wall and my wolf warm and settled in my chest, and thought about the binding seal in the elder library and the quality of a patience that is no longer required. Supper that evening, the lords present, the arrangement acknowledged, was the most relaxed formal meal Varnhello had managed in some time. Lady Mare revealed at the last course that her daughter had been looking for the sedge variant on the western bank for 10 years. She said this with the precision of a woman noting a relevant data point. She looked at Senna when she said it. Senna received it with a focus that went very still and warm simultaneously. The look of someone who has understood something and is now understanding its full scope. What's her preparation focus? Fever reduction compounds, specifically the extended duration applications for the mountain packs in the winter months. Senna set down her cup. That's the preparation where my father suspected the sedge oil was significant. He never had enough material to confirm the mechanism, but he was fairly certain from his notes that. Lady Mare was leaning forward. Tell me what his notes say. They talked for 40 minutes across the supper table about fever reduction mechanisms and oil compounds, and the upland preparation tradition that intersected with the valley method in ways neither of them had had a collaborator to confirm before. Cassock, who had not entirely followed this turn of the conversation, ate his dessert with the content satisfaction of a man who has placed something in the right hands and is watching it be received well. Errol had his notebook out. Worth, who had been doing the alarming thing he did at good meals of appearing to be present while being entirely elsewhere, arrived with a start at the phrase, sedge oil volatile component, and began contributing without transition, as though he had been party to the conversation from the beginning. Nobody pointed out that he had been absent for the prior 40 minutes. The conversation absorbed him with the smooth efficiency of a discussion that had found its third participant. I looked at these people at my table and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing being what it ought to be. After the meal in the corridor before the lords retired, Cassock stopped me. He was a formal man, not given to personal statement, but he had known Senna's father for 30 years, and there are things a man of 30 years standing with a family cannot keep entirely formal. My lord, he said. Then, after a pause in which he appeared to come to a decision, she's happy, already. He nodded and went to his quarters. Lady Mare, passing, said, send word when the sedge is up. I'll send my daughter with a proper kit. She did not wait for an answer. The lords departed the following morning. Cassock said something to Senna in the outer yard before mounting that made her bow her head briefly and lift it with genuine warmth. Lady Mare said something short and received from Senna a nod that had the quality of two practical people reaching an understanding. Errol shook her hand with the efficient satisfaction of a man who has completed a task well. When the party had gone through the gates, Brode said, she's staying. She is. He looked at the gate, then at me. Fenwick slept in the east wing corridor last night, he said. Rook was in the courtyard at dawn by the east wing door. The mid-rank wolves have been bringing her river stones territory markers, the good kind. She's been putting them along the drainage stakes in the kitchen garden, because they're the right weight for the purpose. She knows what they mean, I said. I told her. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, with the quiet of a man who has been waiting for something for a long time and has just received confirmation that it is going to happen. Then he said simply, "Good, well done." He went inside. I stood in the empty outer yard in the cold and thought about the binding seal in the elder library, and the inner ring that had been open since my father's time, and the particular quality of a patience that has been kept for years and is being told, at last, that it can let go. The first full evening after the Lords left, we ate at the small east wing table as we had done every evening since the third day of the treaty week, and the conversation was easy in the way conversations are easy when two people have gotten through the necessary formalities and have arrived at the simpler thing underneath. She had a question about the pack's governance structure. Not a diplomatic question, a genuine one, the kind a person asks when they are trying to understand how a place works because they intend to be part of it and want to understand it correctly. The bond and the governance, she said. They're related, aren't they? Not just symbolically. The bond gives the Alpha access to the pack's consensus, I said. Not mind reading, nothing like that. More a directional sense, whether the pack is at ease or not, where concern is concentrated. A governor without a mate is governing with one less source of information. She turned her cup in her hands, thinking, "Is that why the succession question mattered so much to your council? Not just the heir question, the actual governance question." "Yes, though most of them wouldn't have named it that way." Broad would have. Broad would have, I agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "Will the bond," she started, and then stopped and restarted in the more precise direction. "When a mate bond forms with a human, someone with no wolf of their own, what does the other side of it feel like for the Alpha? I've read the Upland Pack accounts and they're all from the wolf's perspective." The question was entirely characteristic. Not, will this hurt, not, what will change? What does it feel like as a mechanism, her father's daughter, the healer's trained curiosity about how a thing works? "Worth says it's quieter," I said. "He's been at 3 wolf-human bonds over his career. He says the human side of the bond has a different quality, less the pack's frequency and more a specific individual warmth, like a banked fire rather than a hearth of many fires." She considered this, and for the human. "You'll feel the Alpha state," I said. "Not the full pack resonance that takes the wolf for the full resonance, but a directional sense of the Alpha's condition. Ease, concern, focus. The way you can sometimes tell from across a room that someone you know well is unsettled." She nodded slowly. "My father used to talk about the Valley Bond that way, how the packs he worked with could read the Alpha state without being told, and how he'd learned to use that when he was working with a sick pack member. If the Alpha was calm, the rest were easier to work with. That's part of it. The other part being that you're actually calm," she said, with the slight dry precision that was her version of humor when she was comfortable. "I'll try to be consistently useful on that front," I said. She looked at me with the warm directness of someone who is choosing to be honest about what they find pleasant. "You're quite often calm," she said. "For someone who governs a hold, manages a pack, runs a valley alliance, and spends significant time corresponding about border water disputes." "The disputes are clarifying," I said. "They remind me what the work is for." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a good way to see it." Outside the east wing windows the winter dark pressed at the glass, and the kitchen garden below was blanketed in its second snow of the season. The drainage channel she had dug out before the freeze was holding correctly. The south bed's mulch was in place. Renwick had confirmed the spring loam order from the green dredge. The hold was doing what it was supposed to do in winter, keeping itself, sustaining what needed to be sustained, waiting for what would come after. "What will you want to do?" I said. "When the spring comes. Not the river and not the garden, I mean what you want the shape of it to be. Here." She looked at me with the assessing look she gave to questions that required her to say what she actually thought rather than what was safe. She had learned over the weeks that the former was always what I was interested in. "I want to keep the practice," she said. "Not as a base in Millbridge my cousin can take the primary Millbridge work, but the Valley consultation work the Upland holds, the preparation correspondence Worth and I have started. I want that to continue and grow." A pause. "I want to be useful here, in a way that's real, not as a figurehead." She met my gaze. "I'm not very good at being a figurehead." "I noticed," I said. "Is that a problem?" "No," I said. "Varnhello has enough people who are good at being figures. It has a shortage of people who are good at being useful." She looked at me for a moment, then we're agreed. We finished supper. The fire burned down to coals. She gathered her correspondence letters and her preparation log and went to the east wing, and I sat alone at the small table for a long moment after she had gone, not lonely, simply present in the shape of the thing that was building around us, the quiet accumulating fact of two people becoming part of the same place. November deepened. The hold's rhythm settled into the winter pattern. The morning briefings, the dispatch correspondence, the council sessions held at the long River Oak table with the 4 warming braziers and Furwick's careful agenda, the kitchen garden under its snow, the workroom smells drifting from Worth's corridor in the mornings, the wolves in their winter arrangements, more time inside, more proximity, the specific particular comfort that packs take in the close season when the world contracts around the hearth, and the pack is the full world. She fit into this, with the unhurried certainty of water finding its level. Merritt reported to Renwick and Renwick reported to me, with the discretion of people who were observing something they respected and did not wish to handle clumsily. She remembered everyone's name, not just the senior staff, everyone. The young man who brought wood for the East Wing fireplace twice a day, whose name was Pell. The woman in the lower kitchen whose name was Sierra and who had a daughter with a winter cough that had been worrying her. The stable hand who managed Ash's care, whose name was Davy, who was 15 and who had developed a serious interest in plant preparation from watching her work the garden and who had, Merritt reported, begun appearing at the workroom door occasionally and being admitted with the efficiency of someone who has decided this person is here to learn and is welcome. She learned Davy's name on the second day and remembered it without being reminded on the 20th. She learned the nature of Sierra's daughter's cough and sent a preparation with Merritt and a note of instruction, and 2 weeks later she asked Merritt how the girl was doing. She asked Pell about his family's farm in the Upland Valley, and listened to the answer with the complete attention she gave to everything she had decided was worth her attention. These were not political acts. She was not building a coalition. She was simply a healer from a 4-valley practice who had grown up knowing that the people around you were the substance of the work, and that their names and their situations were the first information worth having. Renwick mentioned, in one of the briefings, carefully, with the discretion of a man who understands the difference between information and imposition, that the lower kitchen staff had begun leaving a particular tea for her in the East Wing corridor each morning without being asked. The one with the dried mountain herb she had mentioned once to someone in the kitchen, as something her father had grown up drinking. She had not asked for it. She had mentioned it once in passing, and it had arrived because the kitchen wanted to give it to her. I received this information and sat with it for a moment and thought about the binding seal in the elder library. The lords left the next morning. Cassock said something to Senna in the outer yard before mounting that I was not close enough to hear, and she bowed her head briefly and lifted it with the warm-eyed look of someone who has been given something that matters. Lady Mare said something concise, and received from Senna a nod of the specific sort that passes between practical people who have reached a working understanding. Errol shook her hand with the efficient satisfaction of a man who has identified a process that is working correctly and is glad to confirm it. When the gate closed, Brode materialized at my shoulder in the way he had, the second's way of being present without announcing arrival. "She's staying," he said. "She is." He looked at the gate. Fenwick slept in the East Wing corridor last night. Merritt found him there at the first bell. A pause. Rook was in the outer courtyard at dawn by the East Wing door. The mid-pack wolves have been bringing stones, the territory markers. The good ones, the heavy, smooth river stones. He let a moment pass. She's been using them along the drainage stakes in the kitchen garden. Said they're the right weight for the purpose. "She knows what they mean," I said. "I told her what they meant." "She knows," he confirmed, "and she's using them for the drainage stakes." I thought about this for a moment, the precise, practical senteness of it. The pack bringing their good stones to the woman who had been here a week and was already planning the spring garden, and Senna receiving the territory markers and finding them genuinely useful for the kitchen drainage work, and putting them to good use while also understanding what they were. Both things true at once, not intention. "Good," I said. Brode was quiet for a moment, the quiet of a man who has been hoping for a particular thing for a longer time than he had shown, and has now received confirmation. Then, "Well done." He went inside. I stood in the empty outer yard in the autumn cold and let the morning be simple for a moment. Just the sky and the stone and my wolf warm and quiet, already at rest in the certainty of what had been decided. The winter came in with its own intention. Senna settled into Varnhallow with the same quality of intention, not announcing herself, simply becoming part of the place, filling in the spaces that had been empty the way river water fills the shape of whatever holds it, not forcing, not overflowing, simply being exactly the shape of the space. By the second week, she was in Worth's workroom every morning. I use every morning with precision. Not most mornings. Not when they could manage it. Every morning, the arrangement having been established between them without involving anyone else in the negotiation. She had asked Worth if she might use his workroom to continue her father's preparation review work while she was at Varnhallow, and Worth had said yes with the brevity of a man who had just been offered something he wanted, and had no intention of performing reluctance about it. What developed in that workroom over the following weeks was not a student-teacher arrangement and not a consultation arrangement. It was a collaboration of the specific kind that happens when two people with different bodies of knowledge discover that their areas of overlap are more extensive and more interesting than either had expected, and both of them are sufficiently honest to say so. She brought her father's preparation journal, the upland plant methodology he had refined over 30 years, the specific knowledge of variant plants that only occur in the tributary zones and drainage areas of the mountain-valley boundary, and a methodological precision she had developed from practicing alone in a four-valley territory that required her to be right about things, because there was often no one to check with. Worth brought 40 years of valley pack medicine experience, the accumulated notes of his work with my grandfather's and my father's packs. The depth of preparation tradition in the Varnhallow holds specific context, and the kind of hard-won expertise that only comes from having made every significant error at least once and having learned from each one. The errors in his notes became apparent within the first 3 days, not from carelessness, from the accumulation of small inherited mistakes, things that had been passed down from teacher to student with the authority of received knowledge, without anyone ever going back to check the original mechanism. The marsh sage compound was the first. The second was a moon fever preparation he had been running at the wrong concentration for 11 years. The third was the storage temperature issue for the pine resin compounds, the same one she had identified through her father's cold storage accident. Worth received each correction with a specific expression I had not seen before on his face. The slightly wounded dignity of a man who has been competent for so long that discovering incompetence surprises him, followed immediately by the engaged focus of a man who has decided to understand the correction completely, so it never happens again. He wrote everything down in a new preparation ledger, a clean volume, specifically acquired for this purpose, in which the corrections would be clear and permanent and attributed. He attributed them to her. Every correction in the new ledger had her name and the date. I saw this when I brought dispatches through the workroom one afternoon and caught a glimpse of the open ledger. Worth had never attributed anything to anyone in his professional notes in the 30 years I was aware of. She organized the workroom's supply shelves in the 3rd week. I should say, she asked permission first, presented a specific proposal for the reorganization that explained the logic, accepted Worth's one modification without argument, and then executed the proposal over 2 mornings, while Worth supervised with the expression of a man who has been waiting for someone to do this for 20 years and did not know how to ask. The supply shelves, reorganized, were significantly more useful. Renwick, who had occasionally needed to retrieve specific preparations and had navigated the old organization with the diplomatic patience of a man who knows when to say nothing, stopped doing the elaborate thing he had been doing with his expression for 11 years and said, one morning at the briefing, "The workroom shelving is very much improved." "She reorganized it," I said. "Yes," he said, "I thought so." The 2 correspondence threads she opened with Northern Valley healers, the marsh sage compound question and the fever break preparation method, developed quickly and produced results neither thread's participants had anticipated. The marsh sage thread involved 3 healers who had each been working on the same mechanism from different angles for years and had not known each other was working on it. Within a month, they had exchanged enough material to begin confirming the core theory. She managed all of it, the letters, the tracking of each correspondence data, the synthesis of the separate threads into a coherent summary she shared with all 3. She did this from the East Wing table in the evenings after supper. She wrote letters the way she did everything, carefully, completely, without waste. When I happened to be in the East Wing in the evenings, working through dispatch responses myself, we were sometimes at the table together. Working in the same space with the comfortable ease of people who have established that the other's presence is not a requirement for conversation, but also not an impediment to it. Those evenings were some of the better evenings of my governance. She was in the kitchen garden whenever the ground allowed it. November was cooperative, not so cold that the ground was hard, cold enough that she could work without the mud problem the early autumn would have produced. She had a plan that she had shown me on the 3rd week, unrolled it on the East Wing table one evening, and explained it in the organized, efficient way she explained things she had thought through carefully. The plan was specific. It covered the full year with seasonal annotations. Companion plantings mapped to each bed with rationale. The drainage correction work her father's notes suggested for that type of clay over stone substrate. The mulching schedule based on the altitude and the prevailing wind direction she had identified from her first weeks in the East Wing observing the trees. The varieties she had chosen, not for decorative effect but for utility, and for the specific conditions of this soil in this light in this wind exposure. "The south bed will come in first," she said, moving her finger across the plan. "Mid-March, if the winter isn't too severe. The east wall has the drainage problem I mentioned. There's an old stone footer backing up the overflow channel from the winter rains. That needs to be dug out before the ground hardens." "I'll tell Renwick today," I said. "The north bed needs raised planting. There's rubble below the surface. I found it at about 18 inches when I was testing the depth. Feels like cut stone in regular pieces." "Old granary," I said. "My grandfather's time. It fell in a hard winter and was never cleared properly." She looked at the north section of her plan and made a small modification, the notation for raised beds, which altered the spring planting sequence. She did this with the unconcerned practicality of someone adjusting to a new variable and continuing. "Raised beds. We'll need good loam. Can you get river loam from the valley?" "Spring dredge from the Green Bend," I said. annually for the silt management. She wrote it down. She was not asking. She was planning, and she had received information that was useful to the plan, and she was incorporating it. Planning for a spring she was already living in her mind, treating it as the next phase of something she had committed to entirely. The wolves integrated her into their daily arrangements over the course of November, with the systematic thoroughness of a pack organizing around a new element it has decided belongs. Fenwick's post in the East Wing corridor had been established, it seemed, on the night following the Lord's departure and would not be renegotiated. He was there when the household rose and still there when it retired. He did not require acknowledgement of this. He simply maintained his position with the patient certainty of a wolf who has found a purpose suitable to his years and his content in it. Rook came to the kitchen garden in the mornings. His arrangement was more informal. He appeared when she was there and positioned himself in the corner that gave him clear sightlines in all directions and maximum warmth from the south wall, and he watched her work with the detached interest of an elder who is attending to something important while appearing to be resting. When she spoke to him, he listened. He did not respond in ways a casual observer would have recognized as response, but the pack frequency attention was always present and complete. Pale came to Worth's workroom. She came first on the 6th day of the second week, when the workroom door was open for the ventilation senna required for certain preparation work, and Pale simply appeared in the doorway the way she appeared at the edges of things, carefully, with sightlines cleared, with escape routes calculated. She stayed there for the morning without entering. The following morning she entered and stood along the far wall with her shoulder against the stone, which was Pale's management technique for being in a space. By the end of the week, she was lying in the corner nearest the preparation table, in the position that was both the maximum heat and the maximum visibility, and neither Senna nor Worth made any remark about this. The mid-rank wolves brought stones. Broad had been right about the specific type, the heavy, smooth river stones the pack used to mark territory they had assessed as permanent and worth keeping, not decorative, not casual. The stones the pack brought when they meant something. Senna had told me she was using them for the kitchen drainage stakes, and I had thought about this. She understood what they meant, and she was using them as what they were meant to mark. This is mine. This place is mine. I am here and I intend to stay, while also using them for the practical purpose that they served perfectly. The pack's territory markers in the kitchen garden's drainage system. Both things. I found this when I thought about it fully, entirely right. The eastern border water dispute arrived at its crisis point in the 3rd week of November. 2 packs, a shared upper tributary, an autumn of reduced flow from the dry summer upstream that had left both packs claiming the same stretch by November because neither could afford to surrender any part of it. The dispute had been simmering for 5 years through the normal management channels. Border warden reports, the occasional formal letter of objection, the patient accumulating frustration of a problem with no easy solution because the resource was genuinely scarce and both packs had legitimate claims. I managed it by correspondence. 3 weeks of letters crossing and recrossing, the border warden, the 2 pack elders, Counselor Furwick providing the formal governance framing, myself reading and responding and reading again, with the careful patience of a man who understands that these situations require the acknowledgement of every position before any of them can be moved. Neither pack was wrong. The tributary was not large enough. The agreement had to find a way to make insufficient water sufficient, which is the particular difficulty of natural resource disputes and the reason they take time. She had been aware of the correspondence. Not because I had briefed her on it, I had not, but because Broad's dispatching process moved through the East Wing corridor twice daily, and she was in the East Wing corridor with a reasonable frequency and observed things she was interested in. On the evening of the 14th day of the correspondence, over supper at the East Wing table, she set down her cup and said, The Eastern Water Dispute, upper tributary. Yes. Is the problem contradictory, volume measurements? I looked at her. My father handled a similar situation on the Green Bend 8 years ago, she said. 2 holds, 1 tributary, the same argument. The underlying problem turned out to be that each hold was measuring flow at a different point in the channel, one at the high bank marker, one at the low bank marker, so their calculations disagreed even though they were measuring the same water. She was quiet for a moment. If both packs are reporting volume numbers that seem inconsistent with each other, it might be the same issue. I got the correspondence. She read through the last 2 weeks of letters with the focused attention she brought to things she was taking seriously. One exchange in particular she returned to twice. Here, she said, Lord Breck's numbers and Lord Aaron's numbers are not consistent with a split flow scenario, but they would both be correct if they're measuring at different channel points. Lord Breck is measuring at the confluence marker. It's implied in his reference to the white stone. Lord Aaron is measuring at the mid-run marker, which runs lower in autumn. I had suspected something of this kind for 3 days, without being able to locate where the measurement discrepancy was originating. My father resolved it, she said, by establishing a single measurement point both holds had input on selecting, somewhere neither of them had used before, in the middle section, that was far enough from both existing markers that it didn't feel like a concession to either party. They've used it for 6 years. She offered this as information and not as a recommendation. She stacked the letters neatly and put them back together and pushed them across the table toward me and went back to her own correspondence. The sedge thread, I said. The sedge thread, she confirmed. Lady Mare's daughter found a reference in her grandmother's preparation notes that changes the mechanism question entirely. I need to review it before I respond. I took the border dispatch letters. I thought about single measurement points in the middle section. I wrote a letter to the border warden the next morning incorporating both observations. The dispute resolved in 7 days. I did not tell her, but I thought about it. I thought about it along with all the other things I had begun to simply hold. The notes for the spring gardener, the river bank marker, the founding tapestry and the pack's lineage, the locked chest in the armory and the key casting modification, the oil separation temperature at which Worth had been burning off the marsh sage compounds for 6 years. Things that settled in the hold the way good work settles, quietly, without fanfare, because the work is not interested in being noticed. It is interested in being done. She found her way to my study on the 22nd of November. Not looking for me, I mention this because the manner of it matters. She was looking for the record of the Green Tributary survey my grandfather had commissioned in his 43rd year of governance, which she had found referenced in a preparation note of Worth's, and wanted to see the full soil profile section. Renwick had said it was in the study records cabinet, and she had come to find it, and found me there working through the winter dispatch summary at the desk. I'm sorry, she said immediately. Renwick said it was in the records cabinet. I can come back. The records cabinet is here, I said. You're welcome to look. She came in and went to the cabinet with the directness of someone who knows where they're going and doesn't need to make a thing of the territory she's moving through. She found the survey volume, the third from the left in the second row, pulled it out and checked the contents page with the efficient focus she brought to reference materials, confirmed it was what she wanted, and then looked up and said, "There's a soil composition section for the western tributary drainage area from the 43rd year. I want to compare it against the current profile." The current profile. I've been taking soil readings from the western bank and the transition zone for the past 3 weeks, she said, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone mentioning a thing they had simply been doing. Temperature, composition, moisture retention at different depths. I want to know whether the sedge variant is in the same location as it was 60 years ago, or whether it's migrated down the bank. I set down the dispatch summary, Would it migrate? If the river adjusted its course, it would. The upland tributaries change slowly, but they do change. The survey map shows a different high water mark than what I'm measuring now. The course shifted maybe 8 feet east in 60 years. She opened the survey volume to the relevant section. I want to know if the sedge moved with it. I thought about a woman taking soil readings from the western bank 3 times a week for 3 weeks, in November, without mentioning it, simply because it was the correct way to understand the thing she was trying to understand. "May I see what you have?" I said. She looked at me, the considering look, assessing whether this was genuine interest or courtesy. She seemed to decide it was genuine. She went back out and came back in 3 minutes with the measurement journal she kept for the Western Bank work. She put it on the desk beside the survey volume and we compared them. The comparison was interesting. The river had indeed shifted. The high water marks diverged by 11 feet over the surveyed points, and the sedge's probable root line had followed the new moisture profile rather than holding its original position. She was right about the migration. "Which means Lady Mare's daughter," she said, working through the implication, "is probably looking for it in the wrong place. She's using the survey map. I'll need to send her a correction." We spent an hour at the desk with the 2 volumes and her measurement journal, working through the tributary profile and the probable current locations of the sedge variant and 2 other moisture-dependent plants the survey had noted. At some point, Renwick appeared with 2 cups of tea and set them on the desk and went out without commenting. This was Renwick's way of noting that something was happening that was worth noting, without involving himself in it. When we were done, she stacked the survey and closed her journal, and sat back with the satisfied expression she wore when a thing had been resolved correctly. The study fire had burned down while we worked. Outside the window, the November night was fully dark, and the hold's inner court was quiet under its thin snow cover. "The Eastern Tributary Survey," I said. "From the 41st year. It covers the full eastern boundary. The holds in dispute now are in the survey area." She looked at me, then at the records cabinet. "Is the soil profile detailed?" "Detailed enough to tell us where the measurement discrepancy is sourced," I said, "if we're right about the calibration problem." She retrieved it. We spent another half hour on the eastern boundary survey and confirmed, from the 41st year's base data, exactly where the 2 packs measurement markers diverged and what the flow rates at each point indicated. The information was not new, but having it directly confirmed from the historical record meant the letter I sent the border warden the next morning was definitive rather than speculative. She was not trying to be useful. She was simply useful, the way a person is useful who has organized their mind around understanding things correctly and cannot stop doing this when the thing in front of them is a problem that can be understood. When she finally rose to go, with her journal and the returned survey volume, she said, at the door, "The Eastern Tributary Measurement Point, the one I suggested from the Green Bend dispute." "Yes. My father would have suggested the same one," she said. "He was very particular about neutral ground." A pause. "I thought you should know that what I suggested was his method, not mine." "It worked," I said. "His methods usually did." She looked at me for a moment with the particular warm honesty of someone choosing to share something they do not always share. "I miss him. He would have found Worth very entertaining." "Worth would have found him invaluable," I said. She held this for a moment, then, "Yes, he would have." She nodded and went out. I sat in the study alone with the 2 survey volumes on the desk, and the tea Renwick had brought and thought about 30 years of a healer's practice, and the preparation journal she carried everywhere, and the specific quality of grief that sits in a person so quietly you don't notice it's there until they choose once to let you see it. I thought about what it means to be trusted with a small and honest thing. On the 1st of December, she asked about the mare. Not about Ash's history, not about breeding or bloodline. about Ash's age and whether she was comfortable in the cold, and whether the winter feed arrangement was correct. She had been managing the kitchen herb cutting for the stable's bedding hay additive since mid-November, another thing she had simply begun doing, because she had identified that the particular mix improved the horse's winter respiratory comfort, and because the stable's hay supplier had been carrying the right herbs for it without the hold using them. Davy, the stable hand, had apparently been the one who told her about the supplier. This was how she had been gathering information for 2 months, by asking the person nearest the relevant thing what they knew about it, and listening to the answer, and then doing something with the information. She asked about Ash's age, and I told her, 22 in the spring. My mother's horse. She had been foaled the year my mother came to Varnhallow as my father's mate, and she had outlasted my mother by 19 years through the specific stubbornness of a horse who has decided she is not finished yet, and had carried me through my early governance and the first border campaigns and 3 winters worse than this one, and was now 22 and opinionated and still entirely convinced of her own importance. She came to the kitchen garden again yesterday morning, Senna said. Davy didn't notice she'd gotten the stall door open until the garden gate was found ajar. She does that, I said. She's always done that. My father used to say she had a clearer opinion of where she should be than any horse he'd ever known. She was looking at the south bed, Senna said, very attentively. I think she wanted to know what had happened to it. I thought about this. She used to come to my mother's garden, I said. My mother's herb garden was on the south side of the hold, where the sun came in strongest. Ash was in that garden twice a week for years. A silence. The south bed, Senna said carefully, is where I planted the winter rosemary and the sage, in the south light. I looked at her. She might be finding something familiar, she said. The smell. The type of growth, the same light. She paused. I'm not trying to read too much into it. She's a horse, but she was very attentive. I thought about Ash in the south bed of the kitchen garden, attentive to the rosemary and sage in the winter sun, the horse my mother had brought here, the garden my mother's mate had maintained, the 22-year history of a horse who had decided she was not finished yet. Let her come, I said, any time she opens the stall door. Senna nodded. She did not say anything else about it. She did not need to. December brought the Northern Trade Delegation. 7 people from the Northern Territories, Lord Velen of the Upper Timber Range and his 6 representatives, each with their own area of expertise, and each with a specific objective my council had mapped out in the 2 weeks of preparatory work before they arrived. Timber access rights on the secondary Northern Mountain Range. Crossing rights on the upper green tributaries during the spring melt. A standing agreement on the border patrol coordination that had been running informally for 3 years and needed formal status. And underneath all of it, the longer game of whether Varnhallow was a reliable enough partner in the north to merit the significant investment of resources the northern lords were being asked to make in a sustained treaty. I gave it 4 days of sustained engagement because that was what it required. The preparatory work my council had done was thorough, Furwick particularly, who had been at this specific piece of northern diplomacy for 2 years and had the correspondence file memorized. Brode attended every formal session. I attended every formal session and most of the informal ones and the meals, and one very long afternoon in the maps room going through the upper tributary survey data point by point. On the 3rd day, Lord Velen came in for an evening review session carrying the timber calculation that had been the sticking point since his first letter, and we worked through it for 3 hours at the council table while his primary numbers man adjusted figures in response to the points I was making. It took the 3 hours because it was a genuine disagreement requiring genuine resolution and not a negotiation technique. By the end, we had found a number that was not what either of us had come into the room wanting and was what both of us could defend, which was the correct outcome. Senna was aware of the delegation the way she was aware of everything in the hold not obtrusively, simply present and attentive. She did not attend the formal sessions, which were not her territory, but she appeared at the delegation meals with the composed ease she had established in the hold's rhythms, and she had the conversation with Lord Velen's junior boarder representative about the mountain medicinal plants that I watched develop over the second evening, with the particular interest of a man who is now accustomed to watching a woman manage conversations that matter. The boarder representative, a young man of perhaps 25, formal and a little careful in the way of people who are junior but ambitious and know it, had made some comment about mountain pack health during the winter months that she had recognized as containing something incorrect and had gently and completely corrected. He had taken the correction with the slight stiffness of a person who does not enjoy being corrected, and she had observed this and given him the correction source, her father's specific notes from 3 winters working with the mountain border packs, and framed it in a way that made the information his to carry forward rather than a point she was holding over him. By the end of the conversation, he was thanking her for the note and asking how to cite her father's work in his own reports. She did not manage this consciously. She simply managed it, the way she managed everything that required management, by being honest and useful and making certain the other person ended the exchange with something they valued. On the evening the delegation departed, I went to Worth's workroom. She and Worth were at the preparation table with the oil separation experiment set up in the proper equipment, low-temperature bath, 3 samples of the marsh sage variant at different processing stages. The window was cracked for ventilation. The workroom smelled of pine resin and the particular sharp clean smell of the marsh herb in its early processing stage, which was not unpleasant. A preparation was simmering on the side shelf. Pail was in the corner. I knocked on the door frame. Both of them looked up, Worth with the slight resistance of a man who has been interrupted at something important, Senna with the open attention she gave to arrivals in any space she was in. "The delegation left this afternoon," I said. "Northern terms are settled. Worth, the river crossing agreement will go through the council formal process in January. Thank you for the 3rd evening hospitality recommendation." Worth waved this away with the efficiency of a man returning to more important business. "Senna, the separation rate at the current temperature." She gave him the specific number and then looked at me again. "You look tired," she said. 4 days of sustained engagement." She reached for the kettle on the preparation shelf, the one she had moved there in the 2nd week when she established that she worked in this room more effectively with periodic tea, and that the preparation shelf had room for it, and poured a cup and held it across the table toward me. Not asking. Just doing it, the way she did things she had decided were worth doing. I took the cup and leaned against the doorframe and drank, and watched her return to the experiment notes. Worth had gone back entirely to his figures. Pale in the corner, opened one eye to confirm it was me and closed it again. This was, I thought, what it was going to be. This room, these people, this specific comfortable presence of being in a space where work was being done by people who were good at it and did not require anything particular from me. I was not the alpha king in Worth's workroom. I was a man with a cup of tea leaning in a doorway, and that was permitted, and it was a better gift than I had known to want. "Lady Mayor's daughter," I said. "The sedge on the western bank." "I've sent her the full notes on the root profile and the oil content," Senna said, not looking up from the experiment log. "She's a thorough reader. She sent back 14 questions about the soil composition, the transition zone, and the preparation timing. Very precise. Her grandmother's notes changed the mechanism question, which I'm still working through. She made a notation. I'll take her to the site in spring, and I've been thinking while we're there we should map the transition zone along the bend. The sedge is in that location because the roots want both soil types. Other plants are going to be in that same zone for the same reason. If someone mapped it properly in the first weeks after the thaw, before the other growth comes in." "I'll come," I said. She looked up. "In spring," I said. You've mentioned the Western Bank 3 times in as many months. I know the valley. I can help you find where the soil transition runs." A pause, the experiment simmering quietly, Pale's corner breathing. "You said that in the autumn," she said, "when I mentioned the sedge the first time. I'm saying it again." She looked at me for a moment with the full, warm attention she gave to things she was choosing to receive. Then, "Yes, in spring." The thing behind my ribs that had been keeping careful watch since the morning in the lavender garden gave a small, complete, unhurried release, like a long breath taken, like the moment a thing long held can finally be set down. "Good night," I said. "Good night, my lord." I went back through the corridor and the hold settled quiet around me, and Fenwick rose from his corridor post and walked with me as far as the study door, his evening courtesy, and went back to his east wing station. The stars were out over the inner court. The cold was sharp and clean. I stood in the doorway for a moment and thought, this is the shape of it. This is what the shape is going to be, and found that I was glad. The year turned in snow. 3 days of it beginning on the 28th of December, the soft, patient kind of snowfall that has decided to cover everything thoroughly and is taking the time to do it well. The hold quieted under it. The outside work suspended. The kitchen garden lay blanketed and correct beneath its winter mulch, prepared for exactly this. The inner court accumulated its white layer while the wolves slept in the hall and the dispatches backed up pleasantly, and Renwick managed the household with the smooth efficiency of a man who has run a northern hold through many winters and finds them not a problem to be solved, but simply a season to be managed. On the last morning of the 3-day fall, the snow lightened and the pack wanted to run. The winter run was the pack's tradition, the year-turning run through the eastern woodland that the Varnhallow wolves had done since my grandfather's time, the deep snow circuit of the territorial boundary that was the pack's way of standing in their territory and saying, "This is still ours, and we are still here, and the year can change all it likes." I ran with them every year. It was one of the traditions I had not thought to examine because it was simply something I did, a thing I was as much as a thing I chose. Senna asked that morning if she might come. Not with the pack in wolf form, she was human, and the question had nothing to do with that. She asked if she might ride out with the run. Ash was in the stable, Ash who had decided by the second week of the stay that Senna was the most interesting person in the hold, and had been attending her to the kitchen garden on appropriate mornings with the proprietorial interest of a horse who has selected her person. Ash had not run the eastern woodland for 2 years. She was 22, and I had not pushed her, waiting for her to tell me when she was ready. She had told me the previous week by standing at the stable door at the time of the morning run, with an expression that any horseperson would have recognized as request. "Come," I said. The woodland run in fresh snow was very good. The pack moved through the eastern trees with the sustained joy the Varnhallow wolves brought to the year-turning run, not racing, not hunting, simply running in the territory because the territory was theirs, and the snow was new, and the year had turned, and there was something in the world that required the specific acknowledgement of a pack in full motion. I ran in the trees and came out at the long field at the edge of the woodland, and they streamed past me in the cold air, and circled the field once with the freedom of wolves who have done what they came to do, and are now simply moving because moving is good. Ash came through the field gate at the center of the pack and slightly ahead of it in the way of a horse who is not competing but is not being left behind either, and Senna rode her the way she did everything, with complete attention and no excess. Ash had a leaf in her forelock from the low branch at the woodland's eastern edge. Her ears were forward. She was showing off. I came back to my own form at the field's far end, and walked to where they had pulled up near the gate. "She goes," Senna said. "She does." I ran a hand along Ash's neck. Ash pushed into my shoulder with the moderate affection of a horse who tolerates me well enough. 22 years. "She doesn't feel it. She went like she was proving something." She was. She doesn't get many riders she thinks are worth the trouble. The wolves were doing the post-run sociability in the snow around us. The rolling and the shouldering and the specific wolf conversation that happens when a run has gone well, and everyone is pleased about it. Fenwick was at the field's near end with the patient satisfaction of a wolf who had come out for the run not because his legs wanted it, but because his years entitled him to stand in the snow of the territory and confirm, once more, that it was his. Rook had simply stopped running and was sitting in the snow with the magnificent self-possession of an elder who has been doing this run for 14 years and does not need to perform enthusiasm about it. I looked at her. She had the look she had sometimes, not the composed look, not the working look, but the open one underneath all of those. The look that was present when she was simply in a moment she was glad to be in. Her hair had come entirely out of its pins from the ride. The cold had brought color to her face. She was in the snow field with my mother's horse and the year-turning pack and the blue sky of the first clear morning of the new year, and she was entirely, simply glad. Today, I thought today. Senna, I said. She looked at me, the open look direct and warm. I want to ask you something. She knew. I saw it, not surprise, not calculation. The look of someone who has known for some time that a particular moment was coming and has been quietly ready for it. Something in her settled very still. All right, she said. I want you to be my mate. The words were simple because they were true, and true things do not require ornament. Not as a treaty, not as a council decision, as the thing I have wanted since the morning you told me my lavender soil was compacted and apologized for having said so. I held her gaze. I want you to say yes because you want to, not for any other reason. She was quiet for a long moment. Do you remember what I told you on the first morning? She said. That you weren't here to perform. Yes, she looked at me with the full, honest, warm attention. I've meant everything I've said to you since that morning. When I marked the sedge bed on the western bank, I had already decided I was going to stay. I'd known for 3 days. I came here for a polite week and found things worth staying for. The garden, the library, the wolves, Worth, the smallest paws, the small table in the east wing and the conversations that happened at it, the binding seal above the library door. She met my gaze with all of it, none of it held back. You were one of the things worth staying for, so yes, as the thing I want. Ash stepped forward and pressed her nose firmly, and with authority into my chest. I laughed, felt it arrive from somewhere I had not been certain still had it. Senna was smiling, the real one, the warm, unguarded one that lived below all the composed ones, that I had been catching glimpses of for months. Your horse agrees, she said. She usually does. I covered her hand where it rested on the saddle, cold from the ride, and held it. Come back to the hold. Brode is going to have something to say. Brode has been saying something since the 3rd day of the treaty week, she said. Very loudly, without using any words. I walked her back across the snow field with my hand over hers, the pack moving around us in the good post-run ease of wolves who are well and warm and in their territory. And Fenwick fell into step at my side with the calm satisfaction of a wolf who has been waiting for this specific walk for a considerable time and is content to be taking it at last. I told Brode before lunch. He was in the study going through the January Council agenda items when I came in from the eastern field, and he looked up and read my face with the comprehensive efficiency of a second, who has been reading this specific face for 14 years and knows every version of what it says. He set down the agenda sheet. He was quiet for a moment with the particular quality of quiet that means something is being received and processed and stored correctly. Then the ceremony. After the solstice, I said, Small the pack and household, Worth the 3 Riverhouse lords. The binding seal. After the ceremony. A pause, her wolf, she has none. The bond forms through the mark, I said. I've spoken with Worth. She doesn't need a wolf of her own, and I won't ask her to be anything other than what she is. Brode was quiet for a longer moment. The study fire crackled. Outside the window the snow field was white and still, the pack's tracks already filling in softly where the fresh fall had resumed. He looked at his agenda sheet and then put it face down on the desk, which was the closest thing to a ceremonial gesture Brode permitted himself. "Good," he said simply, "well done." He picked up the agenda sheet and went out. I stood in the study alone for a moment. The fire, the snow outside the window, the full, settled weight of something decided, not the tension of deciding, not the anxiety of process, but the clean gravity of a thing that is done and is right. I went to find Senna. She was in Worth's workroom, as she was most mornings, with the current preparation ledger open and Worth on the opposite side of the table arguing about extraction ratios, with the engaged forcefulness of a man who has found something worth arguing about. Pale was in her corner. The workroom smelled of pine and cold air, and the clean astringency of dried herbs, and the specific comfortable complexity of a room where serious work happens every day. She looked up and saw my face. "I told Brode," I said, "if you'd like to know that part first." "How did he take it?" "With dignity and 2 words. "That sounds exactly right," she said. Worth looked at both of us and then at his extraction ratio problem and made a clear decision about priorities. "The ceremony," he said to the table. "When?" "After the solstice," I said. He nodded. He did not say anything further, not congratulations, not the formal acknowledgement the situation arguably warranted, but he made a small notation in the corner of his current page. I saw the corner of it, the date and a small symbol in her name, filed. The ceremony was small and honest. Renwick's interpretation of "not elaborate" was what I had expected from Renwick, which was that he had heard the instruction and translated it into the most correct possible version of itself. Nothing excessive, nothing performative, but every deliberate element done with the care that made it what it ought to be. The hall dressed with winter pine and white-berried branches from the eastern wood, not arranged in the formal style, but placed with the eye of someone who knows how to make a space feel held without making it feel managed. Candles placed at the intervals that gave the best light without suggesting the light was a statement. The windows polished until the winter moonlight came through them clean and white against the stone. The hall smelled of pine and cold stone and beeswax, and underneath all of that the faint trace of the bread that had come from the kitchen at the evening bell. The household smell of a working hold on a winter evening, not staged, simply the honest smell of a place that was alive. Warm enough for the wolves to be comfortable along the walls, cold enough that you could feel the season pressing at the glass, and the warmth inside was a thing earned rather than assumed. Merritt had come to Senna that morning and asked, very simply, whether there was anything needed. Senna had said she didn't think so. Merritt had looked at the dress she was considering, and at the braid she was planning for her hair and had offered once to assist if she wanted it. Senna had said yes, please, to the braid, not the dress. Merritt had braided her hair with the precision of someone who knows exactly how to do a thing and takes the care to do it correctly. The braid at her left temple was done with a strip of cloth the color of ash, not ornamental, intentional. When Merritt told me this afterward, she said she had not mentioned it and had not needed to. It had been immediately understood. She walked into the hall alone. Not announced, not escorted. Simply walked in through the east door with the composure she had carried since the first morning. The unheld, unperformed composure of a person who is simply themselves, in a room, doing a thing they have decided to do, and came to stand at the hall's center across from me in the candlelight. She wore deep green, not elaborate, not bridal in the formal constructed sense of the thing, but the kind of dress you wear when you intend to be entirely and precisely what you are and have dressed in the color that is yours, the deep green of winter pine, of the green river tributaries in the shadow of the valley hills. She looked like something that belonged here, in this hold, in this specific winter evening light. Not because she had made herself that way, but because she was that way, and the hall had simply recognized it. She looked at me with the full, honest attention. She had turned on everything that mattered since the first morning in the cold garden. I felt the wolf in my chest rise to meet her. Worth stood at the hall's eastern station in his formal robe, found, pressed, wearing it with the dignity of a man who has attended ceremonies for 40 years and knows which ones matter. He said nothing before beginning. The rite does not require preamble. It has its own authority and knows it. The binding words are old. I had heard them twice in the years of my governance, once at my father's ceremony, which I had been too young to fully understand, and once at a second's bonding in the valley pack 3 years before. I had learned them as ritual. I had thought I knew what they held. I did not know what they held when the thing they described was true. The words were not ceremony this time. They were recognition, the formal acknowledgement of something that had already happened, in the language that the pack tradition had developed over generations precisely to say this thing precisely. There is a grammar to the binding rite that does not exist in ordinary language. It speaks in the present continuous tense because a bond is not an event but a condition, not a moment but a duration. It says this is so, not this is beginning, not we intend this is so. When the mark settled into me, not as something placed there from outside, but as the completion of something that had been forming from within, from the first moment of the first morning, building in the way that bonds build when they are real and not arranged, she reached up and touched the back of my hand. The healer's touch. The touch she used to check on things she was attending to confirm that the thing she was attending to was all right. I turned my hand over. She put hers in mine and I held it, and the bond was complete. The pack along the walls made the sound that is not a sound, the frequency shift I had been feeling since the third morning, the collective recognition of wolves who have been attending to something for weeks and have now received the confirmation they required. Not loud, not dramatic. The small, complete, certain shift of a thing settling into its correct position. Rook sat down on the right side of the hall with the absolute finality of an elder who has rendered a judgment and will not be revisiting it. Pale, who had entered the hall carefully and taken the corner nearest the east door, pressed her shoulder against the stone wall and watched with the wide, soft eyes of a wolf who is witnessing something that has the quality of rightness and is very close to it. Fenwick, who had been at his east door post before anyone else arrived, remained at his post through the entire rite with the stillness of a wolf who has been keeping this station for months and finds that the station has now been confirmed. He did not move. He watched. He was content. Cassock, in the witness row, was smiling the smile of a man who put something of value into the right hands a long time ago and is now confirmed in the wisdom of that placement. He had known Senna's father for 30 years and had known Senna since she was young, and there are things a man simply knows about the people he has known for a long time, and what he had known about Senna was that she was the kind of person who, placed in the right situation, would become exactly what the situation needed. He had not been wrong. Lady Mare stood with her hands folded, watching with the complete focused attention of a woman who does not miss things. She had assessed Senna in the formal supper of the treaty week, and had revised her assessment at the Sedge conversation, and had been revising it since, in the slow, continuous way she revised everything, accounting for new data. Her current assessment, whatever it was, showed in the specific quality of her stillness. Errol had his small notebook and was writing in it with the quiet efficiency of a man who finds that good information should be recorded. Whatever he was noting was his own business. Worth closed the rite and sat down in the nearest chair, and appeared to consider the remainder of the evening something he had earned by attending, and intended to receive accordingly. After, when the hall had opened to the celebration, Renwick had arranged with the particular understated care of a man who is good at his work and knows how to honor something without overwhelming it. We slipped away. Not dramatically. She caught my eye from across the room, and I came to her, and we went out through the east corridor while Brode watched from his position at the hall's center with the expression of a man who has organized things so that this particular departure would not be interrupted, and had done so deliberately, because 14 years of service had given him the knowledge to know what a thing required. The elder library. "I want to show you something," I said. She came without asking what it was. The binding seal above the door. She saw it before I said anything. She had been in this library enough times, in the months she had been in Varnhallow, that she knew where to look. She looked up at the seal above the door and was still. The inner ring was whole. Not a change that announced itself. Not a glow or a warmth or a moment of transformation. My grandmother had told me, in the one conversation we had about it when I was 11 years old and she was 60, and I had asked, because she was the only person I could ask, what it had felt like when the seal closed. She had said, "You look up one day and it is whole. It is not a dramatic thing. It is simply that it is whole, and you are glad." She was right. The inner ring that had been open since my father's 3rd year of governance, since a winter when my mother had not come back from the fever, since the seal had sat incomplete through all the years of his governing, and then all the years of mine, since I had walked through this door perhaps 1,000 times, and looked up at the break with the particular quality of looking that does not acknowledge what it sees because it is too accustomed to the thing to really receive it anymore, was closed. 3 rings, all holding. My grandmother's seal had held 60 years. Senna looked at the seal for a long time. The lamp between us was the low, warm light of late evening, the kind that makes old things look like what they are, kept and present and continuing. "Your grandmother's seal," she said quietly. Her seal, my grandfather's governance, was 60 years. They were practical people, they ran the hold well, they kept the valley alliances, they managed the pack and the border with care. But by all the accounts I have, they were also genuinely each other's, not as a performance, not as a diplomatic arrangement, as a fact. She looked at the seal, then at me, the lamp between us. Outside the library window, the snow had begun again, the slow, patient kind, settling on things without disturbing them, covering the courtyard and the kitchen garden and the western tributary path and the flat stone at the bend where her marker still stood in the earth, waiting for spring. 60 years, she said. 60 years. A pause. She was looking at the seal with the considering expression she wore when she was assessing something she wanted to be precise about. Then, "That's a reasonable starting estimate." The bond settled now into the warm, complete certainty of a thing that has been going to happen for some time and has now happened, answered her with the warmth that had been accumulating since the morning in the cold garden. Not fire, not urgency, the steady warmth of something that intends to continue. "At least," I said. We stood together in the elder library while the snow came down outside, and the seal above the door held its 3 rings whole, and the celebration went on in the warm hall beyond, and Fenwick came. He always came now, because the east wing corridor had given way to this larger territory, and he occupied all of it with the same patient authority, and lay down in the library doorway with the deep, content-sighing exhale of a wolf whose prediction has been confirmed, and whose long years of service have now arrived at their proper conclusion. I thought about the first morning, a cold garden and a crouching woman, and compacted soil and gray eyes looking up at me with the steadiness of someone who had decided she would not be undone by meeting the Alpha King of Varnhallow before breakfast. I thought about everything that had followed. The bond had known. It had known in the lavender garden and confirmed it in the practice yard and been certain of it in the elder library the first time, when she looked at the open seal and said what she honestly thought about it. It had been patient. The way bonds are patient when they are real, had waited for the process to complete, had held itself with the settled warmth of something that knows what it is and does not need to hurry. I had caught up now. We had 60 years ahead of us at least, and very possibly more. And the things those years would contain, the western bank in spring and the kitchen garden in summer, and the small table in the east wing on the evenings when we were both working, and the room was easy and warm, and the dispatches could wait, were things I had not known to want until she arrived and showed me, simply by being what she was, that they were available. The seal above the door held its 3 rings whole. Fenwick breathed slowly in the doorway. Outside, the snow settled on the hold in the valley and the river and the flat stone at the bend, and covered everything with the patient certainty of a season that has decided something should rest, should wait, should be kept safe until spring comes and the ground thaws and the sedge sends up its first new growth at the bend, where the current slows and the soil holds 2 different kinds of truth at once. That was the shape of it. That was the shape of everything. That was enough, more than enough, and it was going to keep being enough for a very long time.